Judith, you have studied eschatology, which normally is you hear in churches and sermons, and you approach it from an intellectual academic point of view. Looking at the book of Revelation and the New Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, the book of Daniel, there are kind of radical images. How can, if I asked you to help me understand what those meant, how long would it take you to do so?
It depends on how long you had. But those aren't the main images that I focus on in my work. I focus more on the eschatological images that are spread throughout the New Testament writings, and then frankly on eschatological thought as it develops over the course of Western history, because of course so much of it doesn't stay contained within religious thought. It spills out into philosophical thought, into political thought, and so forth. But if I were to pick out something briefly to show you what it is that I'm most interested in, I would pick out the kinds of images in the New Testament that suggest that we are not yet what we are to be. There are lots of images of the world groaning in birth pains, or of us being like seeds that are sown but not yet sprung. So there are all these images that suggest that what we are now is just an embryonic form, or just a seed form of what we are meant to be. And I think that's fundamental to the Christian religion, at least, less so to the Jewish one, but to the Christian religion, that there is a sense in which the world is not yet complete, and the world is not yet fully itself, and neither are humans. So part of what interests me about eschatology is this question, all right, if we are to say that there is a future, let's say a future encounter with God, those are also quite prevalent images, right? That now I see in a glass darkly, but then I shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, but as I'm fully known. If there is a sense in which our identity won't yet be revealed or even established until an eschaton, well, what does that mean about living in the world now? How do we orient ourselves towards that? How do we orient ourselves within the world?
There's a bifurcation here between an eschaton as it might affect me personally, and if it would affect the entirety of the physical world or the physical universe. So you're sort of blending the two together. I'm not sure where one starts and the other stops, because we each can have our own personal eschaton when we die, or a resurrection or something like that.
Yeah, true. And of course the two must blend together to some extent. It's useful to keep them separate conceptually, but of course ultimately,
well, not necessarily. We all can go through our own thing. The world can continue. It is just spouting out humans, and then we have our own eschaton.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's easier to think about the personal dimension because it's so easy to understand the ways in which we as individuals are incomplete and always remain incomplete. You know, we always have our identity in some future that we can't foresee or control. And so we're always living towards what could ultimately be called an eschaton, even if that's for many people an eschaton, or an eschatology without eschaton, because it ends in death. It's much harder to talk about the world as a whole. And so usually from an academic perspective, I step back from making claims and only look more particularly at the ways in which different people have conceptualized the course of history. So there I'm more an intellectual historian, I think, than I am a philosopher or a theologian.
And looking at exemplars of this in different forms?
Exactly. So German nationalism, you know, which is very clearly an eschatology of sorts. And I'm very interested in the ways in which the 19th century saw Germany very much as a nation of spirit that follows and realizes the world spirit and draws others into that. And the way in which Nazi ideologues, for example, used or drew in philosophers who thought that they were talking about roughly that sort of thing, when of course they weren't talking about any spiritual realities. They were talking about Germany as an entity of blood and soil. But they very much utilized this sort of apocalyptic expectation. So the way in which apocalyptic expectation, because it's so prevalent and powerful, is used in these various forms is something that obviously interests me.
Yeah, so I mean, but that is a sort of a political analysis of how the world has kind of usurped that religious idea for its own political purposes.
True.
So that's nothing to do with what's real.
That's true. And as I say, it is much easier to talk about the uses to which it's been put. I think at some point one has to take a step back and say, okay, you know, this is such a powerful and sort of ineradicable belief that perhaps we should step back and think about what that in itself means.
When you do that, what happens?
Well, when I do that, then I think...
Late at night, when no one's around,
that's right.
no one's criticizing you academically for absurd ideas. What do you really think?
What do I really think? I think that I desire a state in the world that's better and more significant, or no, more complete than the one we live in. And I don't know whether that desire is incoherent or whether it is coherent. But I want to push as far as I can in the direction of seeing what happens if we assume that it's coherent, and see what happens.
I hope you're right.
Thank you. I do too. But if I'm not, then it doesn't matter.